Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to day 4 of the IPI Virtual World Congress, where we're reimagining journalism with 2020 vision. And today, well, it's all about deep thinking and talking about the big challenges that we currently have to the integrity of journalism. First up, we've got some real talk about fake news. Some of the brightest reporters and thinkers who've been leading the conversation about disinformation to journalism right now. Damaso Reyes is the founder of Clarify.Media, and he'll be leading the conversation today. And he's joined by Craig Silverman, BuzzFeed's media editor, Cristina Tarda from the International Fact-Checking Network, and one of our good friends and supporters, media philanthropist Craig Newmark. Now, just quickly, housekeeping, feel free to chat away in the chat box. In fact, please do. And of course, drop your questions in the Q&A box, and in the second half of the session, Damaso will pick those up and the panelists will answer those. And with that, it's over to you, Damaso.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and talking with this great panel. It's been 10 years since I actually went to my first IPI conference in Vienna. So this is an exciting time for me, and I'm really honored to be asked to moderate this panel. I'm going to start with a little PSA. The term is really popular, but we want everyone who's listening here to stop using the term fake news because it has been it's been used as a cudgel. It's sort of lost all meaning. While fake news does exist, it is a very particular type of misinformation. And there are lots of other types of misinformation out there that are probably a lot more prevalent. And we've seen from politicians to trolls on social media, whenever they see a piece of news or information they don't like, they just use this term, oh, that's fake news. So we want to get away from that. And we want to start talking a little bit more about misinformation. And I'm going to start with Craig. Since we actually have two Craigs here, I actually have to identify them. I'm going to start with Canada Craig Silverman, who is BuzzFeed News' media journalist and covers the media. Craig, you actually helped to popularize this term fake news and helped to coin it, much to your shame. So can we just wrap up early and just blame you and move on here? Is that a fair assessment?
I mean, this wouldn't be the first time people have said blame Canada, right? So, so I mean, I will take some. You know, I mean, the point is very relevant, which is that, you know, the type of disinformation that fits being called fake news. And that's sort of what I started reporting on and talking about back in 2014, which was websites that looked like news websites, but everything written on them was false, was fake, and they pretended to be real news websites. And that was, you know, one very specific type of actor that was financially driven. And we have a very complex ecosystem now with lots of different actors, with lots of different motivations, lots of different kinds of content spreading. And so, yeah, we need to be more exact about the terms we use.
Can you expand a little bit and talk about, you know, for a lot of our listeners and a lot of journalists and reporters and lay people, the idea of misinformation, the term fake news bubbled into their consciousness in 2016. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of misinformation over the last 4 years? Obviously, in 2016, we did see a lot of fake news, misinformation masquerading as news. Now we're seeing some different things. Can you talk a little bit about what you've been covering and how you've seen this information evolve?
Yeah, and it is constantly evolving, which I think if you're going to try and cover a report on or research this area, you have to be prepared to adapt all the time, because the adversaries, the people who are consciously creating and spreading this stuff, are always looking for new approaches, new techniques to bring into play. So that's just one reality of the space. And it's kind of this interesting dynamic where there wasn't as much attention being paid to this kind of an issue until towards the end of 2016, until not only the US election, but Brexit and also the elections in the Philippines that year, where obviously Facebook was a big factor in all of those. And what we saw in those cases were, you had kind of a couple of categories of actors. You had, of course, political actors, whether directly with campaigns or very hyper-partisan, very engaged people trying to, manipulate people using social media platforms, spreading false, spreading misleading information, amplifying harassment and trolling, and that kind of stuff. So you have those kinds of actors. And actually, I'll say three actors. The second kind, of course, we've seen state actors. So you had actual, countries in some cases trying to influence another country. So like, Russia and the US in 2016. But then you also have, the countries within the countries themselves of the disinformation that is taking place there. And that, of course, goes back a very long time, for example, in China, where, there's the so-called 10-cent army, where they have people who will flood on behalf of the state and the Communist Party, flood social media channels in China with kind of distracting, more innocuous information when there is a conversation happening about something sensitive. And then the other group is really kind of more in the fake news realm, which is the financially driven actors who were making huge amounts of money on Facebook, particularly in the United States, from 2015 into 2016. Like I've seen financials from some of these groups where they literally had like maybe 2 full-time people, a few freelance writers being paid very low amounts of money, but they had big Facebook pages that were driving insane amounts of traffic, and they were earning hundreds of thousands of dollars in ad revenue a month. It was insanely profitable. And now we have all of those actors, and we have seen all of those actors evolve. I think the pure fake news ones have been hardest hit because Facebook and others, that was the easiest place for them to crack down, right? And so the people doing 100% false stuff to make money have a harder time doing it. And it's really moved a little bit more from a domestic industry in the US to a foreign one, where people who are in countries with low costs of living, low incomes, are still trying to make money from advertising, putting stuff in English. They make less than they did in 2016, like the Macedonians, but it's still enough money for some people in some countries. One of the big changes that I would highlight that we've seen is the professionalization of disinformation. And so there are now dedicated PR firms who basically do disinformation for hire, media manipulation for hire services. And these have been documented in countries around the world. There was actually just a recent one where Facebook did a takedown related to activities from a Washington, DC based PR firm who some unknown client paid them to be spreading political messaging in Bolivia and some other countries, and they were doing inauthentic activity. So we're seeing global PR firms, being paid to do campaigns. There was a company in Israel, Archimedes Group, that was doing work in Nigeria and other countries around the world. So-called PR in the Philippines has a standard part of its elections, whereas that was the anomaly to a certain extent in 2016. So the professionalization is a big piece of it, and that's obviously harder to contend with if they're well-funded and really motivated. And the last one I'll note quickly is, I talked about how these adversaries are always adapting. One of the areas that they often adapt things from is kind of the sort of shady marketing and search spaces in digital. So that the things that shady affiliate marketers do to trick you into signing up for something off of Facebook, those techniques are often being adopted by disinformation agents, state-based ones, other kinds of actors. And so the interplay between for-profit activity, whether it's in PR firms or marketing, and that morphing into disinformation is an area where a lot of the innovation is now happening. And it is still very lucrative. 4 years later, it's not like it's, things have gotten demonstrably better. There's been progress made in certain areas, but other things, new threats are emerging all the time.
Cristina, I wanted to ask you, as journalists and editors, a lot of the people watching here are journalists and editors. We see a piece of mis or disinformation, we suspect it. For a lot of people say, oh, let's do a fact check. What have we learned over the past few years? Because obviously there's been a boom in fact checking. There are international fact checking organizations, local fact check organizations. What should we as journalists be careful of when we're trying mis and disinformation, especially trying to do fact checking?
Hi, Damaso, everyone at the II. First, I want to thank for the opportunity to be here and really have the chance to hear both Craigs. I mean, it's just a master, amazing to be around, and thanks for that. To your point, Damaso, I really believe that first, there is no doubt it is growing. I might not be sure if this is the silver bullet for the misinformation, but
I mean,
when
fact checking is the solution. We just need more and more fact checking, and then everything will, all our problems will disappear. No?
No, I wouldn't say I mean, I know a lot of people really wanted fact checkers to, like, you know, finish and end problem, but we just won't. Just like, you know, how investigative reporters can't kill them, maybe fact checkers will not end misinformation. Please believe that trying hard, but that we alone will not be able to do that. That's one thing. But second, what I would like to your point, is that, well, as journalists, we can do much better than what we're doing today, at least from my humble point of view. When you get a headline, why would you just quote a celebrity or a politician on something that he thinks is correct, or, you know, and do not write, you know, some critical thinking around it? You know, I'm Brazilian, and we hear a lot of crazy claims coming from our president, Jair Bolsonaro. We see a lot of press just putting the claim as the headline with no analysis. So why do we keep doing that? And another topic on your question too, Damaso, the way we deal with photos. Why can't we just, you know, be careful when we use and talk about fake photos and fake videos? Shouldn't we just put a tag over it when we are reporting about it? I'm not sure that every single media outlet in this planet does that. I've seen the other day, again, back in Brazil, we got a very funny joke around a bill, a money that would be created by Bolsonaro to, you know, dodge the inflation that is again rising. And every single newspaper wrote about that funny bill, but nobody put the fake information or, you know, satire tag over it. And can you imagine how Google image is going to look like in 80 years? So maybe researchers from 80 years, in 80 years, we'll look back and say, oh, maybe Brazil had that bill. And no.
I think one of the important things that you're raising, I think I just want to amplify, is this idea that as we seek to debunk and fact check, it's really important for us as journalists and editors to add context. There's a phrase that's become more popular now. It's called the truth sandwich, is when we're pointing out a lie, we start with the truth, we mention the misinformation or the lie, and then we end with the truth. We have to make sure, even in our headlines, even in our social media posts, it's really incredibly important that we contextualize the information. And if we're, you know, posting a video or a photo and debunking it, it's really important for us to do some kind of watermark or so that video or photo can't just be taken or a screenshot. Oh, look at the New York Times, they posted this photo. It's really easy for information to become decontextualized. It's one of the most popular forms of misinformation.
And Dana, so going back to your point, the sandwich idea, we have seen some thinking in the fact-checking community about our ratings. Is it okay just to say something is false, or should we tag giving more information? Should the tag be, this is not the word false? Should it be like old or old photo? Should it be out of context? You know, should we use other wording or other language to explain why something's false, to be straight to the point? So we can even do better in our ratings. So we need to have new techniques. And I completely agree with Silverman when he says that we need to get ready, because the enemies out there, they're very smart and they're moving fast.
I want to talk with our good friend Craig. We're going to call him Craig Byrd, since Craig Newmark is a big fan of birds in addition to his philanthropy. Craig, can you talk a little bit about why this is important to you? Can you maybe give us a little bit more of a 40,000 foot view? There's a lot of inside baseball or inside football happening here with us journalists and editors. But what does this mean? What does misinformation and its impact mean to the greater public? And why have you chosen to support journalism to fight it?
Well, there are bad actors throughout the entire world who are seeking to destabilize democratic countries by virtue of contaminating the news supply. They are producing enormous amounts of false information, either just ordinary misinformation, which is just wrong, or weaponized misinformation that is disinformation. The purpose of that, again, is to destabilize democracies. Sometimes, in the case of some countries, to place in very high office, let's say, their preferred candidates. And that's a form of warfare predicted first a while ago by Sun Tzu in The Art of War, talking about warfare is based on deception. But that's been an active part of the arsenal of a number of autocratic countries for well over a century now. So the problem that we have in the US and other Western democracies is that we have foreign adversaries who are working with their domestic allies in order to create floods of disinformation, crowding out accurate information. The solution to that, in many cases, was proposed by my Sunday school teachers. This goes back about 60 years ago, when they advised us that it is not good to bear false witness, which is to say, do not disinform people, which is a policy first advocated by a French man named Moses, acting on behalf of a much vaster entity. And that's the beginning of a technique which can be used by modern journalists. That is, if they know that they're being confronted with disinformation, which is very frequently the case in the US press, they can just refuse to repeat the information. If they feel that they do have to repeat it, as Chris suggested, they could use the sandwich technique, I think invented or first proposed by George Lakoff, but mostly advocated for Margaret Sullivan from the Washington Post. Again, you can choose not to repeat the disinformation, or you can include it, you can produce it or air it in a form where people are very clear from the beginning that what they're about to hear is a lie. There's a lot of people out there who are a lot better about this than I am, because I'm a dilettante, an outsider, trying to clear the way for the people who are doing the real work. As an engineer, I have the advantage of just getting to the point, suggesting to journalists to not amplify disinformation. A big challenge is coming, I think, next week in the first US presidential debate, where I'm suggesting to some people, please, if you hear an obvious piece of disinformation, call it out immediately. It'll happen.
Chris and Craig, let's dive a little bit deeper. My training as a journalist, and I think a lot of journalists' reflexes is important. A politician says something that's not true, we have to make sure that everybody knows about it. When are we doing the public a disservice by doing a fact check or amplifying, not amplifying, but talking about a piece of misinformation in maybe a way that unintentionally amplifies it? And how do we weigh these journalistic instincts we have to always correct the record and always make sure that the truth is out there versus maybe unintentionally amplifying misinformation? Christina, do you want to take that first?
Sure, I can go first. So, and that matches with some questions we're getting in the Q&A. We need tools to see what's trending, right? I believe that what fact checkers and journalists in general cannot do is give oxygen to bad information. This is like number one rule nowadays in newsrooms and in anywhere, actually. I mean, even individually. So we need to find ways and good ways to track what is viral, what is going viral in different social media before we decide what to fact check. Because right now I'm talking to you using my laptop, and I have a bunch of different systems telling me on Twitter what's trending on Google, what's trending on Facebook. I don't have going to tell me what's trending on WhatsApp. That's bad. And this is, I would say, like the first step that a good fact checker needs to have in order to decide what to work on.
So,
I mean, you are not going to take the last one in the list. You're probably
right. So maybe if it's not already beginning to bubble up, we don't need to help it bubble up by amplifying it. Craig, what are your thoughts when you were talking with your colleagues in BuzzFeed, and you swim deep into the sewer of misinformation, so you have a lot to choose from. How do you guys weigh this, like, here's something that potentially could go viral, so we want to try to inoculate people, versus it's already viral. Will this fact check or will our article about it even matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of tipping point discussion is really important, and it can really vary widely as well from one newsroom and one reporter to the next. And so I encourage people to think about what your standards are and what your levels are as a newsroom before you get in a situation where you have to make a call in a very quick kind of scenario. And so some of the ways you put that together is you do want to look at something using, some of the tools that Cristina talked about, and look at it and say, okay, how much attention is this getting? And then I think another lens that you apply to that is also thinking about our audience for the work we do. What are the chances that they have been exposed to this and seen this, or might be, to your point, Damaso, about where is it going to go and how big is it going to get? And so mapping that to your own audience and thinking about that, I think, is really important, because there is a danger of, trying to just knock down everything you can ever find, and many people having not seen it because they are not, as you so eloquently said, swimming in the sewers of this stuff. There's a lot of stuff that we see when we're on this beat that other people don't, because we're on. And so the tipping is really big. I think going on the sandwich piece of it, you have to be extremely mindful how you present the information. You have to avoid repeating the falsehoods as much as you possibly can. You have to provide clarity so people understand, but you've got to put that true information at the forefront. And also, as much as possible, when you can, tell a story, because if someone is susceptible to that piece of mis or disinformation, you need to give them a way to kind of release that and accept a new narrative, a new story. So thinking about how you can do that, whether through storytelling techniques or through using sources that you think people who are likely to sort of believe the falsehood would respect, and find those sources and put them front and center. So rather than it just coming from you as a sort of newsroom or journalist authority, there's other people in there who those folks might look at as credible, and put the voice through them, because that might be more accepting to a lot of people.
Damaso, jump in with a big comment on what Craig said. I really want to raise the question of ethics at this point, because every time you choose what to fact check and what not to fact check, you're making a really, really hard decision. And I really want to share with our audience a personal experience that I had back in February, when we weren't in lockdown in Tampa. I'm in Tampa, Florida right now. I was back in the office, and we had the Coronavirus Facts Alliance going on, and I can talk about that later a bit. But we got this information about, people should drink pure alcohol to get rid of COVID. And I said, this is just ridiculous. Why would I fact check this? I cannot even call a doctor and say, hey, is this true? I mean, this person's going to laugh at me. So no, I forget about it. And so 4 days later, we got news from, I can't remember which media outlet, saying, 40 Iranians dead, poisoned by pure alcohol. So you're making really, really tough decisions, because we won't be able to fact check everything. So viralization is important, but also you have to understand what is really dangerous. Maybe it's not in your own opinion, because I kind of made fun of it. I bring some caipirinha, and I'm curious.
Right. Craig, Newmark. You're in your funding, you're a big advocate of I think supply side, right? Get more good information to people to help them make good decisions. Can you talk a little bit about some of the projects you're funding? And I think you have an announcement, or you just made an announcement, and talk a little bit about how the things that you're funding are helping to maybe change and the media landscape a little bit more inclusive?
Years I've been funding a pretty broad spectrum of journalism and information warfare operation, sometimes to give people a break. For example, a couple of years ago, I made a contribution to the City University of New York, the journalism school, realizing that CUNY is a major leader in the US, in a big way responsible for getting a lot of people into the middle class in the US. That is, that the CUNY principles exemplified the notion that you should treat people like you want to be treated, and you should give people a break. As of today, we just announced something similar for Howard University, which is a historically black university. I'm announcing a contribution of a couple $1 million or so to the Howard Journalism School. The idea is to get more people, more diverse voices into newsrooms who will tell stories that, you know, people like me never wind up hearing. Events in the US in the last 6 months have helped me realize how clueless I am and can be. So instead of just complaining about the problem, it's better to help get resources to people who can help solve the problem. And this also includes the Black Media Initiative at the CUNY Journalism School. That's the pattern, to get a lot of resources to people and then, for the most part, get out of their way. The exceptions sometimes are, throughout journalism, in fact, I'm telling people that, you know, I will remind them to do a better job of communicating what they're doing. I will tell journalists to do a much better job of keeping themselves safe. And I warn them that they'll have to learn to tolerate humor.
That truly is a hazard, but one
the third is
really,
a hazard.
we're going to with. We're getting some really great questions in the Q&A, some of which are actually relevant to our conversation. And it's actually something I wanted to bring up, but just to amplify something that Craig Newmark just said, is that diversity is actually a key component, and inclusion is a key component, should be a key component to the work we do to fight misinformation. If your newsroom does not look like the community in which it's based, does not look like the community in which it's supposed to serve, then you're likely missing out on pieces of misinformation. For example, I was born and raised in the US. We don't really use WhatsApp in the US, but in places like Latin America and other places in the world, WhatsApp is a huge platform, and it's also a huge platform for misinformation. So why, if you're in the US, well, you may have members of your community that are immigrants or the children of immigrants who are using WhatsApp, who are being exposed to this misinformation. And if you're not aware of that because you don't have folks in your newsroom who come from those backgrounds, then you're actually doing a disservice to your community, and you're missing out on an important beat. I want to dive into the questions, since we have a couple that I think are going to engender some good discussion. Hugo Williams, who edits the COVID Misinformation Hub for BBC Africa, asks, well, he asked himself, but I think it's a question for the panel as well, is, does the work that we do actually make a difference? Does fact-checking work? Does it help? We do know that misinformation spreads a lot faster and a lot further than oftentimes when you have correct information out there. So there is a asymmetry there. But Chris and Craig, are we just tilting at windmills here? Should we be focused on, can we put our energy to other things, or do we maybe need to be a little bit smarter about how we do it, or do we need to just do more of it? Can you guys talk about that a little bit more? Craig, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of some of the research coming out, and probably knows it better than I do, but the research around the efficacy of fact checking is actually relatively encouraging. And so, it's really that there can be and there are effects. And the context I would put around is to be realistic about what our expectations are about what fact checking can achieve. if you have someone with a very strong point of view and a piece of falsehood that really relates to that point of view, the idea that one fact check is going to change their mind, if that's your expectation, it's not realistic, right? And sometimes I think we fall into a trap of saying, well, you know, it's not like fact checking is going to change minds. And that's not necessarily the goal. At a fundamental level, you got to put stuff on the record, because there is an accountability aspect to this work. And some of the studies have shown that, for example, when politicians know that fact checking is occurring in a race or in their district, they actually have changed their behavior. Now, does that affect Bolsonaro? Does that affect Trump? No, it doesn't. But those are actually still the exceptions. And we shouldn't give up on holding accountability and that kind of correcting the record and basic journalistic work. And the other thing that I would also say is, you know, part of fact checking for me is always about revealing who's behind it whenever we can. And I think that's also an important accountability piece. We can't always figure out where something originated, but when we combine that fact checking and verification work with the exposure of bad actors and making it there to be a cost for bad actors, I think that also has cumulative effect. So Hugo, you should feel the work you're doing.
I completely agree, Hugo. Thank you for doing the work that you're doing. Based on the Coronavirus Alliance production, I can tell you that if I completely believe this, it's not a crazy woman saying, we have debunked 9,000 hoaxes together as a collaborative project. It's a lot. Alone, we none of the partners in this alliance have done anything even close to that. And thanks to that connects to what I was saying before. We are not seeing like stupid hoaxes like the bat soup caused COVID, or those crazy videos showing people fainting on the streets or in the subways as if COVID could cause you sudden death. These are gone. We are not seeing that. So again, we have to take a look at some research that has been done lately. I mean, there are some saying that there is a 10% chance of a politician not repeating a claim that it was rated as false. This is a really interesting study based in the United States, of course. I mean, I don't think that would work with Bolsonaro or Trump either, but it was done here. And there are some really interesting things coming up. So really, we have to play the context. And when we do fact checking, and I believe fact checkers, the fact checking community works this way, we are not working to convince the polarized people to come back to like the rationale. We're not doing that. We're doing the opposite. We're avoiding, let's say, normal people to not polarize. That's what we're doing. So let's try to understand that fact checking is just giving people the facts. It's not changing people's mind. So your goal should not be something else different from that. You are just giving the facts. You shouldn't aim to change people's opinion, to change people's vote, or to change people's beliefs.
I wanted to dive into some other quick questions. We actually have a question from Simon Lee, and he actually wanted an example of how you do a good truth sandwich. Can someone give us an example of maybe something that a real event or a recent falsehood that they can frame, maybe Chris or...
I suggest you look at, let's say, PolitiFacts articles. You're going to see, you know, the structure of how the fact-checking article is written, usually written. I would go for the big ones, you know, PolitiFact, factcheck.org, and how they write the content. You're going to see that something has been detected, is considered false. And why this is considered false. Then again, at the end, the sources that sustain the writing. And even some of them have like, if you only have 3 minutes to read this is what you need to read. So find a way, if you're a journalist, take a look at how you write a fact checking. I mean, this is really important.
I actually want to direct the second part of Simon's question to Craig Newmark, because you mentioned that you were talking to journalists and asking them not to amplify. And something I alluded to a little bit earlier is that we as journalists, we have this instinct, right? We have this desire to not ignore things, but to talk about them. So how do you think we should balance that, or can balance that, right? Because we don't want to be accused of ignoring what, important people, especially people who are influencing public policy, say, right? If President Trump says something false about COVID, or says, I'm going to direct the FDA to do X, Y, and Z, and I, as a journalist, know that that's false, do I not have an obligation to inform the public about it? Or more importantly, how can I do that responsibly from your perspective?
I'm pretty simple-minded, and my focus is on the relatively easy stuff. The deal is that if a major figure like the president, in a fairly obvious way, and that's the norm, in fact, they can just report that saying something like, the president lied about COVID again today, here's the truth. And that way you get to the point. Well, that way you get to the point really quickly. You provide some useful facts to people which might keep them alive. You can move on to the next thing. I'm oversimplifying deliberately, and we're taking a pretty obvious case. There's lots and lots of gray areas involving checking and truth-telling, but at least in US media and US politics, we're getting flooded with a lot of fairly obvious disinformation. And, maybe it's time to take the enemy.
We got a question from Kathy Keeley, one which I think is hopefully easy to answer and potentially incredibly useful for folks, is what are 3 cheap and easy tools that underfunded newsrooms can use to monitor social media in their area for disinformation? Craig and Chris, do you guys have some ideas? I mean, I know CrowdTangle is a really good tool that journalists can sign up for to see what's trending on, I think it's social media in general, not just Facebook. Is that right?
Yeah, so CrowdTangle is a free tool. It's owned by Facebook, and you do need to get an account created. But the people at CrowdTangle are very helpful in dealing with newsrooms, and they like to give accounts to newsrooms. So you're able to look for and search across content on Facebook. You keyword searches and also specific pages. And they also have tools that enable you to look at Instagram, Twitter over the past, also on Reddit. So CrowdTangle is a fantastic monitoring tool. There is, it's a website that you log into where they have the search and then the pages and group stuff. But there's also, even if you don't have a CrowdTangle account right now, there is a CrowdTangle browser extension, which is free to use as long as you have a Facebook account. And if you are on a specific article or piece of content, it will give you data on how that has been shared and spread on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit. Another one that I'll throw in there is Twitter is a fantastic monitoring tool, and you should use Tweetdeck. You can set up columns, filtering around specific search terms. You can set thresholds around engagement. If you want to see tweets that are getting a certain amount of engagement, say 100 retweets or more, you can filter to do that. I think those 2 alone, which are both free, are extremely powerful for newsrooms. And, I would also encourage you to think about what Google Alerts you could set up. They're not necessarily as real time as Twitter or as Facebook or what have you, but if there are certain topics that resonate in your coverage areas or your geographical areas, you should be using potentially Google Alerts to see what's bubbling up, because you may find some surprising results there.
Google Trends is another really useful tool, and that is fairly real time. It's open for anybody to use. Chris, what tools are you using to monitor misinformation?
Well, besides those that are, I think they are great and they do enough. The fact-checking community has an interesting tool that was developed just for the partners of the third-party fact-checking program with Facebook. It is a really good tool to tell what's going on Facebook, but that's not for free and it's not open. So I start my day taking a look at that one. And there is a great tool that I really would love that WhatsApp had that, like officially, but they're just not doing it. It was developed by 2 universities in Brazil. It's a WhatsApp monitor, and it tracks public chats. I don't know how used to WhatsApp universe our audience is, but it tracks all the links to WhatsApp public groups, and it reads anonymously all the content and all the videos and all the photos, and including all the audios being shared in those public chat groups. And it's open for fact checkers. It's really, really interesting. And it helped Brazilian fact checkers to track whatever was going on back in 2018 during the election. So it's a really, really interesting, and I've been pushing really hard to get WhatsApp adopting that as a real tool, but they believe by tracing the public chats is kind of violating, what is that? What's the word? I missed that. The privacy, that's not encryption. Encryption, that's the word.
Encryption. Quick question from Diane. Is anyone monitoring sort of large scale or industrial level misinformation? Are there organizations or groups that are sort of looking at the botnets and things like that? Craig, did you raise your hand there? Craig Newmark?
Yeah. There's a number of groups which are reasonably well funded, focusing on examining and then recommending strategies to counter large-scale disinformation. They use the term influence operations or information operations because this has been an item of study for some decades. On the west coast of the US, there's the Stanford Internet Observatory. In the Washington area, the Carnegie Endowment coordinates an alliance called the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations. And within those groups, within those alliances, there is a whole bunch of these. There's one at NYU, the acronym of which is CSMAP, and I can never remember what it stands for. There's a lot of people doing this kind of work. I'm hoping that in the next 40 days, a lot of people of good conscience take what's learned from these groups who've monitored disinformation and starts to do a decent job of countering it. And that's the challenge right now for American democracy. Otherwise, we're in trouble.
We have a question from the Czech Republic in Jaroslav, who was interested in what I brought up about sort of inoculating or maybe being prophylactic in our approach when we fact check. Does this work? Does it have an impact? I mean, Cristina, you mentioned this example around COVID and drinking alcohol, and how you said, well, we don't need to focus on this because no one's going to fall for it. But afterwards, you were kind of thinking, well, maybe we should have done something to alert people that if you see this, it is false. And I think we've been seeing a lot of this around COVID in fact checks. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, or Craig?
Sure, I can take that, and I can jump into a very important topic that is related to COVID vaccine. I really would love to see more reporting about how we need to deal about all the misinformation and disinformation regarding this vaccine. We as journalists, we need to teach people like how slow the process is going to be. How many times will studies stop to analyze data with patients that are taking the vaccines? I mean, every time there is anything related to the COVID vaccine, boom, you see like this explosion of hoaxes. So it's time for explanatories. I believe that it's related to the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, it's less about fact checking because we don't know much or almost anything about the vaccine because it doesn't exist yet. It's much more about explanatory time. So we as journalists, we need to write detailed information about how does a vaccine come up? How do you test it? How long does it take? What are the entities that need to approve it? How different is it from one country to the others? So it's time for explanatory. I believe the inoculation, this is the thing.
And Chris, I think you raise a really important point. One thing that we as journalists have to get out of the habit of is thinking, we did this story 2 months ago. We don't need to do it again. You do need to do it again because obviously there are often updates that you can do, but we also need to repeat ourselves because not everyone saw it last Tuesday when we published it on our website or we posted it on Twitter. So go back. If you see something that you've done a story on that's trending, go back and post it again on social media. I've actually been seeing journalists do this a lot. Sometimes you don't need to write a whole new story. You just need to make the public aware of what you've already done.
It's a great point. It's a great. So since the virus has started in Asia and it moved across the started in February, arrived in South America in April, and hey, we have debunked this like a long time ago, and you guys are talking about this now. This is being done, and we realized that hey, we are talking about different audiences. You're completely right.
Since we're on the topic of COVID, that's a great segue to a question from Susan Abbott, who wants to know more about conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories, it used to be just something that if you happen to be at a bar and you got sat next to the wrong person, they talk to you about aliens and assassinations. But we're seeing a lot of conspiracy theories around COVID, especially in 5G and government conspiracies. How do we as journalists combat conspiracy theories, which are even they're a kind of misinformation, but one that tends to really envelop people into a whole world of misinformation? How do we? Is it possible to reach those people who are sort of trapped in this world of misinformation? Craig, I know that you spent a lot of time in the subsewers of conspiracy theories. What approach do you take to writing about them?
Well, in terms of the approach, one piece obviously is you want to think about whether you're amplifying a new and emerging conspiracy theory and introducing it to people before they've ever heard of it, which is not a great scenario because you don't want to radicalize people as part of your reporting. I think one of the guiding things around reporting on conspiracy theories is you have to understand why they can be effective and why people get pulled into them, and you should use that to inform your reporting. So in the moment we're living in right now, we have this global pandemic. It's a really complicated scientific topic. It is something that hasn't really been experienced for about 100 years on this kind of a global level. And it is extremely confusing and fear-inducing in people. And so when we are in a state like that, when we are panicked, when we are fearful, when we are worried about our jobs and our families and our health and all of those things, we tend to want to find simple answers and simple solutions. The complexity of the world is overwhelming for us, and we like to create order. And conspiracy theories really help feed into that and provide order in a chaotic world. And so that's one thing that it's important for people to understand. The second reality is if we look at what's going on, for example, in the United States right now, you have people like the president who are actively amplifying and pouring gasoline onto conspiracy theories. So we have people in traditional positions of power and authority who are giving winks and nods and sometimes outright endorsements of conspiracy theories. So that creates a very powerful approval level of thinking this way and behaving this way. And so for journalists, I mean, obviously we need to point out how completely non-standard and dangerous it is for that to be happening. But also our job in a lot of ways is to explain what's going on in the world and to try to give people context and make sense of it. And I think as much as possible, the daily work of explaining events in clear ways with good facts, doing storytelling in ways that resonates with people is on its own a strong defense against conspiracy theories. And then in dealing with them in particular, we again, like with the fact-checking conversation earlier, we have to be realistic. Pulling people back who are fully down the rabbit hole is a very long and difficult process. But if we can maybe give some breadcrumbs that they might be able to find along the way, that their relatives and family members and loved ones can use to help talk to them about, then those are really helpful things.
That's a really good point, and I want to make a pitch to the editors in the room. Is that I know that sometimes fact checking can seem like a bit of a daunting task. So we need to hire a specialist. We need to like make a whole vertical for this. But I think that perhaps the best thing we can do as journalists is to actually make sure we are weaving in fact checking into our daily work as journalists. And there is training available. There are opportunities, but it's not something that that guy over there in the corner does. It should be something that we do, and we find ways of doing it in our regular work. And to expand on that, we have a question from Ravi, who asks, how can vernacular media organizations in Africa and Asia who do not have the wherewithal to have a fact-checking process be helped? There are very few fact-checking groups on these continents and mostly underfunded.
No.
Chris?
Asia is the region of the planet with the biggest boom in fact checking. I mean, the latest state of fact check report just gave that information. Asian is booming. Byrd, the director of the IFCN, and I, we spent like almost a month in Asia. We are amazed. Asia is getting really, really big. Just in India itself, it's the country with the biggest number of fact checkers in the IFCN community. And in Africa, we used to have just only one fact checker, and now we have was Africa Check. Now we have Pesa Check. We have Dubava. We have so many. I mean, these are regions where fact checking is growing. We are very, very excited to see that. And Damaso, if you can, let me just comment on what Silverman said before. I think the conspiracy theory, my goal is to get a bunch of soldiers, fact-checking soldiers. We need people to spread the truth, and we need to use technique to spread good facts. And this is why the IFCN has been developing and putting and launching WhatsApp chatbots. I mean, we have chatbots in Portuguese, Spanish, English, and Hindi for COVID content. And now we have chatbots for election in Spanish and in you combat conspiracy theories by doing what people call fire hosing. I don't know if our audience understands the expression, but you do the fire hosing movement, but in reverse. You do with the truth. So I would say just get the truth there.
I think one thing to highlight is there is training. There are resources available. The basics of fact checking, I think, are relatively straightforward and obviously take a long time to master. But it's something, going on my earlier comment, is we actually want to build this capacity in. As journalists in the 21st century, fact checking, the ability to fact check, the ability to verify information digitally is incredibly important. So I know that First Draft News has a lot of free courses. Pointer has free courses, and these are digital courses. I know that First Draft News has actually translated several of their courses in a bunch of different languages. So look for the resources that are out there and look to build that capacity within your community. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and maybe this is a larger question. But how aware are people of misinformation on social media? Your average user of social media or information, how aware are they that this is a problem or that they might actually be encountering it? And how are they to recognize misinformation when they're exposed to it?
There's been recent studies, I think Pew maybe, that do show that people understand that a lot of what they see is misinformation or disinformation. They just don't really know how to figure out what's what. And that's something that I think the press, at least in the U.S., has to rise to. Trustworthy institutions need to establish themselves as such. The key to that might be like the trust problem in the U.S. reporters have the Journalism Trust Initiative, which might be the beginning of the solutions, but no more than the beginning.
So I'm pretty sure that we did not answer the organizing question of this panel, but the truth is, to summarize, is this: misinformation, we're not using the term fake news for those of you who joined us late, is a problem that belongs to everyone. Whether you're a journalist, an editor, a citizen, this is something that impacts our daily lives, and this is something that we have to pay attention to. As journalists and editors, we have to talk about misinformation. We have to do it in a responsible way that doesn't amplify it. And we also have to build tools and make this part of our coverage. We can't ignore it. It's not going to go away by itself as much as we hope it does. So we have to support our journalists, and we have to support our readers by being accurate, by being transparent, and by not being afraid to call a lie when it's appropriate, no matter who happens to be uttering it. So we are just out of time. Chris, Craig 1, Craig 2, do you guys have any parting things, anything that you didn't get a chance to talk about yet that you want to mention?
Let me just quickly note that in the chat there, I've dropped links to a free online course that me and a bunch of other people are helping teach. It's free, it's online, it's global. Starts October 5th, sign up for that. And also dropped a link to the verification handbook for investigating media manipulation and disinformation. It's free, it's online, and it was funded by Craig Newmark. So thank you, Craig, for that.
Yes.
I just want to say that I'll be a student, so meet us there. And I want to invite you to take a look at the Code of Principles of the IFC. And I understand that some of our audience is willing to start fact-checking or to improve their fact-checking skills. So take a look at the Code of Principles. I'll drop the link in the chat also. It's important to be transparent about the sources, about the methodology, about the funding, and also to have a public correction policy, and obviously it should be nonpartisan. So thank you so much, Damaso and IPI.
Okay.
Well, for me, in 2016, the press, which is the immune system of democracy in the US, let us down. I really hope that they save us now, because things look shaky in the US.
Okay, and that's the final word for this panel. Right on time. Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Cristina and the Craigs, and of course, Damaso. Thanks so much for such really practical insights, advice, and pointers to the tools that you've shared. And congratulations to Craig Newmark and to the Howard Journalism School for that really strategic investment that Craig talked about in the panel. Because I think we all know that, many different media voices, many different media organisations doesn't always translate to many different media voices. So I think that this kind of strategic investment in, supporting the expansion and diversification of media voices and content is really so important. So thank you to our panel.